Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to be simply a thought process of westward expansion. If you look on the map up here, here are the two territories of Kansas and Nebraska, okay? Which, by the way, are above the 3630 latitude line, which means according to the Compromise of 1820, Missouri Compromise of 1820, they should be free territories. Okay, keep that in mind. Okay, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now what happened in 1854, remember Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois had this vision of building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago west to the Pacific coast. That was kind of his vision. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois had this vision of building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago. Remember, he's a senator from Illinois. Building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago westward to the Pacific coast. That was his vision, his goal. Well, a few things had to happen for that goal to be achieved. Most importantly, he had to get the federal government to pay for it. Somebody's got to construct this line, and he's going to try to talk the federal government into paying for that transcontinental railroad that will go from Chicago westward to the Pacific coast. So in order to do that, he sponsors a bill and sends it through Congress. And it includes a couple other things other than paying for this railroad. So again, in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois has a vision of building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago westward to the Pacific Ocean. And in order to achieve that goal, he had to talk Congress, or the federal government, into paying for this construction. So he sends a bill through Congress to see if Congress will pass it. And the first thing in the bill is obviously the request for the money to pay for the railroad. Well, at this time, Kansas and Nebraska were simply land west of the Mississippi. That's all they were. They weren't settled. They were just part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so the second part of Douglas's bill was to create that land west of the Mississippi into two territories, the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. Okay? So this was just a blob of land prior to this. So the second part of his bill is, hey, let's take this land right here west, and why don't we create that into two new territories, Nebraska and Kansas. Now, do you remember, kiddos, what Stephen Douglas's philosophy of slavery in territories was? You decided that. What was what did he like to do? What did he think should be done in territories to decide on the issue of slavery? Anybody remember? Let them decide. Something called popular sovereignty. Okay? And so the third part of his bill was to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the reason he wanted to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, since both Kansas and Nebraska were north of 3630, he wanted them to be able to decide for themselves whether there were slaves there. Well, what did the Missouri Compromise of 1820 state? It had to be free. So the only way that popular sovereignty, or the people in the territory's ability to decide on the issue of slavery themselves, could happen is if they repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Does that make sense?
In order for what that?
In order for that people to decide, because right now north of 3630, according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they have to be free. He wants to repeal that because he wants the people that settle in those two territories upcoming to make that decision. Okay? Now if Congress passes this bill, they finance the railroad, they create Nebraska Territory and Kansas Territory, right? And they allow the people in the territories to decide on slavery because they repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Well, when push came to shove and that went to Congress, it passed through both houses of Congress. Therefore, the two new territories of Kansas and Nebraska are able to decide on the issue of slavery themselves. So what he accomplishes by the bill is financing for the railroad. He creates two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and he has also accomplished the fact that the people that live in those territories, in their territorial constitutions, by vote of the people that live there, can decide on the issue of slavery themselves. Well, soon after this bill passed, what did people start doing east of the Mississippi?
Talking.
What?
Talking.
Well, they did more talk.
Riot.
They rushed into those new territories. It's just like if I said to you, there's a bag of candy up here and some are great big candy bars and some are little minis, you would rush to the candy to get the best one, right? Well, they rushed into these territories to find the best lands to settle. It's like the gold rush, kind of, for land, okay? So, soon after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, eager pioneers and land speculators, remember those people that would get land and then sell it for a profit, they just raced both from the north and the south, from east of the Mississippi into these territories, competing for the best land and the best sites for towns, etc. So people just kind of rushed for land grab like they were kind of rushing for the gold fields during that time. And there were two types of people, pioneers that wanted to settle and land speculators that wanted to get their hands on good land and then sell it later for a profit. Well, in addition to the race to get there, there was also a race to hurry up and get into the territory so they could draw up territorial governments and constitutions to decide on the issue of slavery. So you understand what I'm saying? That people from the south are rushing into Nebraska and Kansas. People in the north are rushing into Kansas, Nebraska to get there as fast as they can, hurry up and set up a federal government so their territory can be what they want it to be, either free or slave. So people are rushing into this land. Douglas has given them an opportunity because you think you'd had such a rush if the 3630 parallel or 3630 latitude line was still in effect? You think those Southerners would have been rushing into there? No, because they knew they couldn't do anything with slavery. But once he opened it up, both Northerners and Southerners from lands east of the Mississippi started pouring into these territories. Hurry up, let's get there. Let's get the best lands. Let's pick the best town sites. Let's get there and get our government set up so we can make it slave or make it free. Well, in Kansas, they rushed into that particular territory. And by the time they got in there and got organized and tried to set up a government, they had about a 50-50 split on the issue of slavery. So they're about 50% of the people who went in there were Northerners and 50% of the people that went into Kansas were Southerners. So they were split on their philosophy. So they even got together, the Southerners in Kansas got together and drew up one constitution, and the Northerners went into Kansas and drew up another constitution. And the territory of Kansas actually had two constitutions at one time, one anti-slavery and one pro-slavery, which is going to lead to what? Conflict. Which just by coincidence is our next subtopic, Bleeding Kansas.
Wait, so was Nebraska already decided on slavery?
It was, yeah, we'll talk more about that a little bit later, okay? Well, when both Northerners and Southerners rushed into the Kansas territory and these differences of opinion occurred on slavery, violence erupted in that territory, giving it the name Bleeding Kansas. Violence erupted. Now, this fighting and violence over slavery in Kansas, before it ended, more than 200 men and women were killed. More than 200 men and women were killed during this violence in Kansas that gave it the historic name Bleeding Kansas. So both Northerners and Southerners rushed into the Kansas territory, and the differences of opinion on slavery erupted in violence. This violence that raged in the Kansas Territory became known in American history as Bleeding Kansas, and the fighting and violence over slavery in that territory took the lives of more than 200 men and women. Now, probably the most notable incident is when a group of abolitionists, a group of pro-slavery individuals, those that were for slavery, got that backwards. So a group of people that were for slavery marched into the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was occupied obviously by those that were against slavery, and they burnt the town to the ground. So an armed pro-slavery group invaded the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was populated with anti-slavery settlers, and burned the town to the ground. This is one example. An armed pro-slavery group invaded and burned the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was populated with anti-slavery settlers. Well, in revenge for that, a white abolitionist, that's a person that's opposed to slavery, a white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathered an armed group, including his own sons, and murdered 5 of those men that burnt the town to the ground. Okay? So in revenge, an abolitionist by the name of John Brown got a group of men together, armed them. This included his own sons, and they murdered 5 of those pro-slavery men. The thing was bad about it, you might think an eye for an eye, but these guys that they killed were unarmed. So they rounded up 5 of these guys that were involved in the burning of Lawrence and killed them. The controversial part was they were unarmed at the time. Usually didn't, those days, kill someone that was unarmed. You gave them an opportunity to defend themselves. Well, they didn't. Well, it got so bad in Kansas with this event and other events in which 200 people were killed that finally they had to send in federal troops to restore order in Kansas. It got so out of hand. You guys ever heard of that rock group, Kansas? You ever heard a song? Carry on my wayward son, I'll be there when you are done. Anyway, that's Kansas 1970s group. Well, here's their very first album. Pretty cool. Very first album, Kansas. Kind of long-haired dudes, but they're, this is 1970 something or other. Anyway, they're, they still perform now. I might, after we pick our Super Bowl picks, I might jack up a YouTube song for you to see Kansas. But anyway, this is their very first album. They came out, became very popular. Look who's on the cover.
John Brown.
John Brown. Yeah, John Brown. And he'll come back into history a little bit later when we get closer to the Civil War and make another tragic contribution to the slavery issue. But I thought that was kind of interesting. They put John Brown on the cover of their first album. You guys even know what an album is?
Yeah.
It's a record. Look at this. This is like pristine shape. This is an LP.
Do you have a record player in here?
Oh, not in here, but I do have one. Got the old Pioneer record player from 1976. That was like a premium cell phone you can get today. Anyway, John Brown's on the cover of the album. So he must have made an impact on the state of Kansas, right? Okay, that was Bleeding Kansas. Well, that'll take us to another presidential election, the election of 1856. The election of 1856. What parties do we have?
Whig Party.
Democrat and Whigs. Well, the old Whig Party's fading out. So look at me, a new political party comes onto the scene in 1856. You know what the name of that was? The Republican Party, and they changed their philosophical views to that of Thomas Jefferson. So these are the Jeffersonian Republicans. It's a new party, same name, different philosophy. But we'll just consider them the Republican Party. So, prior to this election of 1856, a quote, new political party was formed. This quote, new party took its name from Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party. So the Republicans are now going to reestablish themselves into American politics. Same party, new philosophy, so to speak. Well, the Republicans are going to nominate John C. Fremont. Remember the guy that was involved in the Mexican War? John C. Fremont. And he ran under the campaign slogan of free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. John, okay. John C. Fremont. Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. Okay, who do you think that the Democrats nominated? This is going to be kind of important because the greatest president of all time will follow this guy. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. Yep, the Democrats nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for the presidency. Now this is a fairly close election, but people knew a lot more about John C. Fremont because of his Mexican War heroics than they really did James Buchanan. But again, the stigma of Zachary Taylor left, of being a Mexican War veteran hero as president, still hurt Fremont. And as a result, Buchanan wins the election, 174 electoral votes to 114. 174 to 114. Here's James Buchanan right here. He will be our 15th president of the United States. James Buchanan.
Wait, so did the Whig Party?
Whig Party ran no one. Yeah, they were done. They had fizzled out, so to speak. They have taken some beatings. So now, James Buchanan is the President of the United States. He will serve as President until he's replaced by the legendary Abraham Lincoln. All right, we'll take you to an interesting discussion, the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision. Anybody know who Dred Scott was? You read about him in English or any other classes? Who was Dred Scott? Anybody want to guess who he was? And if we say the Dred Scott decision, what might he be?
It's probably a slave.
He was, well, he was a slave. We'll talk about that, okay?
Oh, was he probably like 1/8 or 1/16, something like that?
You got the right idea, but not quite. Okay, on March 6th of 1857, March 6th of 1857, the Supreme Court handed down a decision known as the Dred Scott decision. On March 6th, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down a decision known as the Dred Scott decision. Which means that a guy by the name of Dred Scott appealed something all the way to the Supreme Court. Now whether he won or not, we're going to tell you, okay? So, again, on March 6th of 1857, the Supreme Court handed down a decision known as the Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott was a slave who appealed something all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, what happened is he was obviously denied in smaller courts, that's why he appealed. But what he did is he argued that he should be a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state of Missouri into a free state of Wisconsin. And because of that, he believed he should be free, and he sued for his freedom, and he lost at the local and the district. Now he's at the national level appealing this at the Supreme Court. He's saying again, hey, I was born a slave, no, that's not true. His owner had taken him from a slave state of Missouri to a free state of Wisconsin. Now, if you're thinking about that, do you think he should be free if he's going from a slave state to a free state? It makes sense that maybe he was.
Wisconsin? Is that what it
Yep.
was?
Yep, he was taken from his argument was that he should be a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state in Missouri to a free state in Wisconsin. Now, the Supreme Court actually ruled two opinions on this. I'll give you both of them. They ruled two opinions on this case. Number one, they stated that residents in a free territory and or free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. The second opinion I'll tell you is why that will make sense. Does it make sense? Are you thinking, that seems not fair, right? Okay. So the first decision was that residents in a free territory and or free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. Just because he was moved from a slave state to a free state didn't mean he was free. That was the ruling, first opinion. Well, the first opinion happened because of the second opinion.
Can you say the first one?
Yeah. The Supreme Court ruled that residents in a free territory and or a free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. In simple terms, the fact that he moved from a slave state to a free state didn't give him the right to be free.
Wait, so he was living in the free state now?
Yeah, with this quote master. He thought he should be free because it's a free state. Why would they rule that? Doesn't seem fair. The second opinion stated this. Now listen to